you so much. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be back here in Houston. This is the best place to give a talk, with the nicest people and the most people. I can't believe that you get so many people in one place. And I'd like to particularly thank Alan Livingston, who has been a supporter of mine since I first arrived at the University of Oklahoma, and has taken good care of me, has invited me down here now 3 times, or helped getting me invited down here 3 times, and has been a true gentleman in every way. I'd also like to thank Linda Wiest, who has been a big supporter and just a fine director. I can see it here. And Farah, your new director, Farah Kilidar, who looks like you guys are just very lucky. Let me just jump right into my lecture now. I'm going to end up talking about President Obama's policy in Iraq. But I want to go back and talk about how we got here. How did President Obama get to his policy? And in order to do that, in order to explain what's going wrong in the Middle East and what America perhaps can or cannot do about it, I'd like to make a comparison of what's happened in the Levant in states like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel-Palestine, Jordan, and compare it to what happened in Central Europe in the interwar years. Why am I making this comparison? Because the First World War was the empire-destroying war. The Russian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, German Empire, and the Ottoman Empire were all destroyed. And nation-states were created willy-nilly out of the detritus of these big empires. And in Central Europe, the same thing was done that was done in the Ottoman Empire. At the Paris Peace Conference, lines were drawn, nations were created. But of course, the lands of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and other empires in this Central European area were very mixed, religiously, ethnically, and in every other way. The national borders did no justice to all of those people. They were left to create a common political community and culture. And many of these people did not trust each other or particularly want to live together. And they failed in almost every case spectacularly, which led to what I've called the Great Sorting Out, where the borders were not changed, but the people were. And this was long and bloody. Poland. 64% of people in Poland were Poles before the Second World War. By the end of the Second World War, almost 100% were Polish. Massive bloodletting and ethnic cleansing. Czechoslovakia, 23% minorities, all gone by the end of the war. And this was the case straight down the center of Europe. We're still seeing the great sorting out going on. In the 1990s, with Tito's fall, Yugoslavia, of course, split up into 7 countries. And now Ukraine is teetering on the edge of splitting up between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Little teeny, I'm going to forget, the Crimean Peninsula is in a sense an emblem of what has happened, because just recently we've seen it split off, or split from Ukraine. But Crimea was 5–6% Germans, the population, before World War II. Then, of course, Hitler occupied Ukraine and the Crimea, used the Germans, and when Stalin retook it, he kicked out all the Germans. He had already marched all the Crimean Tatars into Siberia, well over 1 million, many of them dying on the way during the Second World War, the beginning of the Second World War. He rearranged the population, so it's a majority Russian today. But the point here is that this giant redistribution of people. And we have to remember, even from 45 to 47, 13 million Germans were ethnically cleansed from Central Europe. They were the guilty minority, the Sudeten Germans, the Polish Germans, right on down the center, right to Crimea. Because they had helped Hitler, they were collaborators, nobody put up with them. They got rid of them and drove them out of Central Europe. This giant rearranging of people. Now, I submit to you that in the Levant, the ex-Ottoman lands, we have had something very similar going on. People like Saddam Hussein, Assad, these brutal dictators, were in a sense little Ottoman sultans that kept their mosaic of peoples together. But when they fall, like Tito, the passions of religious nationalism, ethnic nationalism, sweep to the top of society, and we're seeing a great sorting out. Let us look at some of this great sorting out for a brief moment. If we go through to, I'm going to turn it on. If we go, here's the rise of nationalism. When I present this in my classes, I look at nationalism as the great marker of modernity, if you will. If you're an IR, if you're a history professor, this is what you would use for modernity. If you're an English professor, I'm sure you use consciousness or some other thing, the nuclear family. But for international relations, the nation state is clearly the rearranger of modern world. Before American Revolution and the French Revolution, the twin revolutions that go on at the same time, there are no nation states. There are kingdoms, empires, bishoprics, free cities, tribal organizations, kingdoms of all kinds, but they're not nation states. That's all new, where the people are sovereign and the sovereigns are servants. It's a new concept. And it sweeps the globe because it's much more efficient than all these other concatenations. And today we have, what, 93 nations belonging to the world, to the UN. But that's been long and bloody to create all those new arrangements, force people to belong to political communities. And it's not over by any stretch of the imagination. But most of the wars, I think, of this modern age are nationalist wars about rearranging those borders and peoples. At any rate, this First World War, you can see, is a giant spike. These nations are created in fits and starts, and they're just getting going. It's not like, well, maybe we're coming to the end, but a lot of people say we're in a post-nationalist age. I doubt it. Let me see if I can get to the next one. No, I can't get to the next one. Maybe I have to point it that way. Nope. I'm going to try again. There we go. Here is the beautiful Anatolia. Anatolia was almost 20% Christian in 1914. At the end of the Great Turkish Revolution, that we can really mark between 1914, the beginning of the First World War, and 1922-3, when Ataturk consolidates the Turkish Republic, beats back the Greeks who've invaded, and builds an independent Turkey. Those 20% Christians no longer exist. Today, there are less than 1% Christians in Anatolia. We know what happened to the Armenians, 1.5 million. They were considered collaborators with Russia during the First World War, and they were driven out of the country, many of them to die on this sort of death march. The Greek Orthodox were considered collaborators of Greece, which invaded Turkey at the end of the World War I and tried to rebuild the Byzantine Empire, and were defeated soundly by Ataturk. And the Greek Orthodox were all driven out, many to go to Syria. Most to Greece, but many to Syria. So that, in a sense, is one form of the sorting out. We can look at little but nice Lebanon, where you have Shiites, Sunnis, Maronites, Greek Orthodox, all kinds of people living together in a small community. In the Levantine countries, there's a little different dynamic than that's going on in Europe, and that's that the colonial powers give a leg up to the minorities to help them rule these colonial states during the interwar years. So in each of the Levantine states, there's a minority that gets to power. In Lebanon, it is the Christians, and in particular the Maronite Christians, who are given the lion's share of power by the French. When the French leave, very rapidly, the Muslim population becomes a majority and begins to demand one vote, one man, because they know that will bring them to power and get rid of the Maronite president, the Maronite chief of staff, the military. 6 out of every 11 deputies in parliament have to be Christian. 15 years of civil war, long and bloody. 150,000 Lebanese killed out of a small country of 3 million. Very bloody. Iraq, same thing. Sunnis, 20% helped to power by the British. The monarchy, Sunni, Hashemite monarchy, and then Saddam Hussein takes power, and he consolidates that power around the Ba'ath Party and the military, both of which are instruments of Sunni domination over Shiites. The Shiites are 60%, the green area in the south, and the Kurds, another 20% in the purple at the top. When America comes to Iraq, it thinks it's going to build power-sharing new nation. I don't know, it has a Washington concept. What it really is doing, of course, is casting down the Sunnis from the top of society to the bottom, dissolving the army, criminalizing the Ba'ath Party, destroying these institutions that were the heart of Sunni power, and catapulting the Shiites to the top. Long and bloody. The Sunnis didn't like to be thrown down to the bottom of society and dispossessed. They organized, they began to resist and fight, and eventually team up with Al-Qaeda and other anti-American groups. For a brief moment, we could turn that around with what was called the Sahwa, or Sons of Iraq movement, where we bought tribal leaders, Sunni tribal leaders, and turned them against Al-Qaeda and gave them guns, power, and promises. But as soon as we left in 2010, we, of course, threw them under the bus, left Maliki in charge of the country, who immediately turned towards these Sunni tribal leaders and saw them as collaborators, fifth columnists who were working with Sunni power, and didn't trust them, marginalized them. Naturally, they all gravitated back into opposition, and then when ISIS swept through Iraq this summer, they joined because they saw ISIS as less bad than the government. Long and bloody, it's still going on, civil war. We can even shoehorn into this equation the Arab-Israeli, the Palestinian-Israeli situation without doing too much injustice. Jews in Palestine, 1850, about 4%. By 1914, 14%. With the rise of Hitler, Jewish immigration to Palestine goes up. The British are occupying Palestine. They help hold down the Palestinians. By the time they leave in 48, a third of the population is Jewish. When the British leave, of course, the Arab population of Palestine believes that it will be able to dominate and keep the country under its own rule. Of course, they lose in the 48 war spectacularly. The Yishuv wins the war and declares Israeli independence. 800,000 out of 1.23 million Palestinians are driven out of the country, never to be allowed to return. A form of ethnic cleansing, certainly a rearranging of people. And then over the next decades, there's the ingathering of Jews. The Jews of Palestine, of Israel, are able to do something that no other minority is able to do, which is turn itself into a majority and solve its minority problem. And we have to remember something that we don't usually think about is that almost 50% of Israelis are Middle Eastern Jews. Baghdad, the largest single religious community in Baghdad in 1914 was Jewish. The Jews of Yemen, Aleppo, Damascus, Morocco are all coming to Israel. Iran, Istanbul. Seinfeld's grandmother, an Aleppan. So long and bloody. The Palestinians do not like to lose their land and be marginalized. They've been fighting ever since to get a hunk back. Will they be successful? For most minorities, they look at this process and they see zero-sum game, which takes us to Syria. The green part there are the people, the Alawites, only 12% of Syria, Shiite heterodox group. Shiites don't consider them Shiites. Sunnis don't consider them Muslim. But they are the poorest of the poor when the French arrive in the green area on the coast. The French create an army to combat Arab nationalism in Damascus and Aleppo, the major cities, led by Sunni aristocrats. The minorities stampede into this military, are very overrepresented. Armenians, Druze, Alawites, you name it. When the French leave in 46, the military quickly takes over. Then there's a slugfest within the military over which group is going to be able to dominate. The Alawites win this constant set of coups and come out at the top. Hafez al-Assad consolidates his power, 1970, and it's been Assad all the way. And it's still Bashar al-Assad. With the Arab Spring in 2010, when the demand for popular representation and dignity begins, Syrians of every color and stripe go to the streets and say, enough. Down with the dictatorship. Get out Bashar al-Assad. We want something better. The Alawites and Assad have prepared for this day. The military is jammed full of Alawites at the top. So are the security forces, the intelligence units. They're not going to step aside. They fear revenge. They fear being marginalized. And they shoot. And they try to put down the rebellion with terrible brutality, which turns very rapidly then into not a liberal demand for justice, dignity, but into a sectarian slugfest, with people identifying with their own sectarian group. And people who would never have seen themselves as sectarian become sectarian. Because in a sense, they're forced to pick sides in a situation where they don't want to. And families are ripped apart, and we know this story from America because we went through our own civil war. But that is where, in a sense, the background, how we got to where we've gotten in Iraq and Syria. Today, this is a picture of Iraq and Syria, the battleground. The pinkish purple areas are where ISIS, the Islamic State, predominates. They've taken over a third of Syria and a third of Iraq to own a hunk of territory that's as big as Great Britain, that includes over 6-7 million people. It's big. Who is there? Sunnis. Why? Because Baghdad is dominated by a Shiite government. Damascus dominated by a Shiite government. In Damascus, Iran and Russia support the government. And in Baghdad, the United States and Iran and Russia support the Abadi government. And the Sunnis feel like they're trapped in a vice grip. No self-determination, no justice. And increasingly they've become radicalized and they've joined ISIS. There are other rebel groups too. This is, the green here is Assad land. The regime still controls the major cities. And although they don't own, there's a light green where their power goes out. And though they own perhaps less than 50% of the land of Syria, they own a lot more than that of the population. Because Damascus, Homs, Hama, the coastal cities, they're big population centers. And Aleppo is in play, being fought over. There are other rebel areas, the brown tannish areas. But in those areas, there are, the CIA estimates that there are about 1,000, 1,500 militias. Some of them have confederated into big overarching organizations like the Islamic Front. But ISIS is clearly the biggest militia. Al-Qaeda, maybe the number 2, the Nusra Front. The Islamic Front competes for number 2. But the Islamic Front is led by the Ahrar al-Sham, one of the biggest coalitions in the Islamic Front, is led by a man who fought against the United States, who went to Iraq, joined al-Qaeda, and fought against the United States during our occupation of Iraq. So we're not going to team up with the Islamic Front. But those are the 3 largest militias. Then there's a lot of little militias. And the little militias that have worked with the United States maybe own 5% of Syria. So when Obama says we're going to team up with the moderates, he's proposing to turn the 5% into 100%. He doesn't mean it. He doesn't want to do it. He doesn't trust them. And he's not going to do it. But he says he's going to do it. This is emblematic of the problems that America has walked into. President Obama's policy for Syria was to stay out. Try to contain the violence of the Syrian civil war inside Syria. That's what he was trying to do. Giving money to Jordan, to Lebanon. He spoke a good game with the Syrian opposition, and of course in the beginning he hoped that it would win and there would be a liberal government in Damascus, we'd get rid of an old enemy, Bashar, and we'd have a better world that was allied with Sunni Saudi Arabia, Sunni Turkey, our friends, against our enemy, Iran. That was the dream. He thought he would be on the right side of history by saying, down with Assad, up with the Sunni rebels. Of course, it didn't happen that way. He wasn't on the right side of history. He sort of fell somewhere. We don't know what the right side of history is anymore. And so he avoided. And he said yes to this and yes to that, little by little, as the pressures in Washington grew. Then, this summer, ISIS busts out of Syria, stampedes through Iraq, meeting no resistance in any of these Sunni areas. The Iraqi army, which we'd spent $1 trillion on, collapses. And they're at the gates of Baghdad. They move so quickly that you couldn't say they won't take Baghdad. If Obama had lost Baghdad, it'd be finished for the Democratic Party. Now, I know the Democrats don't have much sway here in Texas, but they do in some parts of the United States, and they fear for their future. And Obama clearly had to mobilize and do something. And that's what dragged him out of his lethargy, was the possibility that Baghdad would fall to al-Qaeda on his watch. He came in behind the minority groups that were being, the Yazidis that were being slaughtered by ISIS. But that was really a pretext to shore up Baghdad. And then he said, we're not just going to shove ISIS back into Syria, because that would be un-American to leave them head chopping in Syria. We're going to degrade and we're going to destroy. The moment he said the word destroy, my heart sunk. Because it's too much. On the other hand, I understand why he would say it, because who could have the heartlessness to stand up on TV and tell all those people, you're not going to destroy ISIS? But we do not have a policy to destroy ISIS. We say we're teaming up with the moderate rebels. But we just passed through Congress a bill for $500 million. $500 million is chump change. I don't know. The University of Texas must have an endowment of many, many billions of dollars. In Iraq, we spent, $1 trillion building that army. $500 million is nothing. It's not going to, a summer camp for wayward Syrians in Saudi Arabia you might get. I don't mean to be, but it's not serious. Obama knows it's not serious. Everybody else knows it's not serious. Obama is going there to bomb and to try to kill ISIS leadership, not to fix Syria. And he gave this away in his own address to the nation when he said, he compared what he wanted to do in Syria to the few earlier successes in counterterrorism, Somalia and Yemen. Now, every Arab who heard the word Somalia and Yemen and success put together, heart sank to their toes. But from an American point of view, it is a success. No Yemeni, no Somali has killed an American in 6 years, not on Obama's watch. And for America, that has become success. So when he said, I can do that in Syria, what he meant is drones and planes to kill the leadership as much as he could find of ISIS and to destroy their assets. And that's it. And that's where he is today. And we can see how difficult our alliances are by this fight in Kobani in the north of Syria. This yellow dot right up, oh, I've got a pointer. This yellow dot right here is the city of Kobani is at the top of that, but that's Kurdish. The Kurds live in this area in the northeast and a little area above Aleppo and this Kobani area, what they call Kobani, Ain al-Arab in Arabic. And ISIS surrounds them and is driving them into Turkey. 200,000 have fled there, and the Turks have not opened their border to help. They said, America, you want us to help? We can help. But first, we have to agree on what our objectives are. You want to kill Sunni Arabs. We want you to kill Assad. If you kill Assad, we'll all be on the same page. If our determination is to destroy the Assad regime, we can do it. But if your determination is just to come and kill Sunni Arabs, we don't want to be part of this. I live in a country of Sunnis. My premiership, my presidency will go down the drain. While you're saving your presidency, you'll destroy mine. So Obama said, no, thank you. And that's why we're airdropping to the Kurds weapons. These are Kurds whose political leadership is the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, which is a quasi-communist party, 30, 40 years old, led by Öcalan, who's in jail in Turkey. It's proscribed as a terrorist organization by both the United States and Turkey. So we're helping a terrorist organization in Syria, according to the Turks and according to our own law. So we say the PYD, which is the way they've renamed themselves in Syria, is not, at any rate, it's a name game again. But this is the problem. Now, Turkey just switched, I believe, today and said, okay, we'll let people through. But that's because America started to win in Kobani and drop weapons. And Turkey was clearly going to lose, so they decided, well, I better be with the winners. But they don't, their heart's not in it. And they're getting Barzani. Anyway, it's a little complicated, but we don't see eye to eye with our coalition partners on what the objectives, the basic objectives are in Syria. And that's going to make our mission very difficult, and there's going to be lots of people throwing stones at us. And Sunni Arabs, from one end of the Middle East to the other, which are the majority, about 90% of all Muslims are Sunnis, are going to see America as doing a great disservice to their people, because sectarianism has become, in a sense, the new nationalism of the Middle East. The new nationalism has become inflected with religious, sectarian zeitgeist. And it's hard. At any rate, on that dreary note, I'm going to end this lecture and open it up to questions. Thank you very much.
How might Hillary's strategy differ from that of Obama's?
Hillary Clinton said that she would have gone into Syria early and helped the Syrian rebels before the organization and before Syria had become so radicalized. and before the war had destroyed the lives of so many millions of people. A lot of people are saying that, of course, today. There's a lot of memoirs coming out saying, I would have done it differently and it would have been correct. I'm not sure that is right. Why would I argue that that would not be the way it went? First of all, in Iraq, we destroyed Saddam Hussein's regime without the opposition ever firing a shot. And then within a year, year and a half, the opposition began, the armed opposition, as it began in Syria after a year of protest and violence. And then Al-Qaeda emerged, and then everything was radicalized. And today, it's ISIS today. And ISIS came out of Iraq. Baghdadi is from Baghdad. The Caliph is from Baghdad. This is because America went and interfered in the Clinton policy, the Hillary Clinton policy, early and fast. Why would it be different in Syria? If we look at the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the aristocrats started the French Revolution. The Girondists, the nice liberals who would have loved to sit in a room like this and share lemonade and cookies with you and talk oil prices, led the revolution. But of course, it turned into the Jacobins, and then the head choppers, the guillotines came out, and blood began to flow in the streets of France. And that took years for that radical process to go on. Russian Revolution, the same thing. We weren't going to stop this process and make Syria somehow different from all these other examples by going in early and decapitating the regime. We were going to turn Syria into chaos, like we did in Libya, where emulous factions come out. That would be my argument. I'm sure I probably could be wrong on that, but there's no one will know who was right. But I think in the end, Hillary will not do much in Syria because Americans don't want her to do much or spend much money in Syria.
As we all know that ISIS has been taking over, oil areas and so on, and selling oil. Can we stop everyone from buying oil from ISIS?
Good question. I just spent yesterday talking to a journalist in Jordan who's been covering economics and has been on the phone with lots of different people in Jazeera area. That's the oil producing area out towards Iraq and Syria. America has not destroyed the oil wells. It's destroyed the refineries and tried to hit trucks and other things like that. But it doesn't want to destroy the oil wells because then we'll look like Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. Well, maybe that's not what Obama's thinking about, but he would look like it. If you're going to rebuild Syria ever, you need those wells. To destroy, the oil is the only thing that Syria has left. Industry has come to a screeching halt. Business is nowhere. This little bit of oil that ISIS now controls is being sold, is being refined in the backyards of villages. 5 barrels a day. People with fires, sticking it out on open fires and trying to get off a bit of this and a bit of that. And that's what we're doing. We're trawling around, finding those little fires and bombing them. It's not profitable. We've got the easy ones, but Obama doesn't want to go further than that because, like Vietnam, this is a political issue. DOD is not allowed to shoot everything they want to shoot because we'll end up ripping up the place and turning everybody against us, which is what's happening anyway, but we're going to do it more slowly. I mean, I'm being a little bit cynical, but DOD has got its hands tied behind its back. They know who they want to shoot, and they want to be able to be free to shoot targets of opportunity, because most ISIS is target opportunity. You see a column of cars, you see trucks. They've got to phone to Washington and get an okay, because we don't want to kill lots of civilians. Rightly so. At any rate, that's the problem with the oil, is that the oil is still flowing. What ISIS has done is the big refineries have been destroyed, but we're selling a few. They're selling small truckloads to people who go home to their little village and are refining it in the backyard. And we're not going to go and shoot at all those little villages in order to destroy this. And so we don't really know what to do.
I'm going to come combine two questions actually, because they relate to the Gulf states. So how come our government did not lift a finger against Qatar and other allies who helped ISIS? And how much leverage does the US have with the Saudis?
First of all, there's been a big debate about whether Qatar or Saudi Arabia helped ISIS knowingly. Lots of private funds have left Qatar, Kuwait in particular, and Saudi Arabia personal donations. And America was very loath to do anything, to say anything. We didn't mention the names of people we knew years ago who were funding Islamists in Syria, because we were trying to all be on the same page with our allies destroying Assad. It's only very recently that the United States has listed any Saudi, Kuwaiti, or Qatari on our treasury list as people supporting al-Qaeda. And that's only in the last 4 or 5 months. Saudi Arabia has begun to do it, and other countries, Kuwait just banned their first person, took away their passport for doing this kind of thing. So it's happening, but in the beginning, everybody was permissive. The Turks allowed these guys to move across their border. We didn't say no to anybody, and we let it go on. And it was a combined effort. Now, of course, the Gulf Arabs are particularly guilty, I suppose, because their ideology is close to, you know, the notions of jihadism were reinforced on Saudi TV all the time. The ideological help was large, as well as the monetary help for radical groups.
What would be your suggested solution for Syria?
Well, it's a good question. If I could just be living in a different world with no political constraints, an infinite amount of money, I would say Baghdadi has created a good state. Not himself being good. You would wish that somebody else would rule it with a different order, but you've got a Sunni state reaching from Baghdad to Aleppo. Recognize it. Don't destroy it in the name of upholding borders that no longer really fulfill the interests of the people. Give the Sunnis, promise them something that they can take, which is independence. And then get a Sahwa to join you to fight against these radicals, to build a better government. All this is pie in the sky. It's not going to happen. But the only way that you can de-radicalize the Sunnis who are caught in this vice grip is to give them something. Give them self-determination, some justice, a state. That's what they want. That's what Baghdadi is promising them under these, you know, antiquated notions of caliphate and other things. But America's not going to do that. We have to support the Baghdadi government in Iraq, and we're going to try to shove them out into Syria. We could give them half of Syria. I tried at luncheon today, the Turkish consul, new Turkish consul, who had worked closely with Gül and others, was at the luncheon. And I said, what if we didn't destroy Assad? Left Assad in this little hunk of Syria that he's in, but created a Sunni state in the northern and west-eastern half of Syria. Would Turkey, if we created a no-fly zone, the way Turkey's been demanding that we do, would you take half of Syria instead of all of Syria? Would you put in the Turkish army? Would Erdogan put in the Turkish army in order to disarm all these militias and begin the process of starting a new government? The way we did in Iraq, occupation. You could call it something different, I don't know. I don't care about the words, but the way the Syrians did in Lebanon at the end of the Civil War. To disarm the militias and allow the politicians to make a new beginning. He said no. He said, our policy is that Assad has to go. Without Assad gone, there's no way to get rid of radicalism. He's the source of radicalism, not anything else. Of course, Washington is never going to agree on that. And we're going to end up with a civil war that's locked in, because Turkey and Saudi Arabia and so forth all support the Sunnis, the others support, the Shiites support Damascus, and none of them will let their proxies fail, but they won't give them enough money to make them win. And so Syria is locked in this grinding civil war. So in that sense, Turkey won't accept half a loaf, but Turkey doesn't want to send its men into Syria. I mean, this reveals the truth underlying it, is that nobody cares about Syria. Nobody wants to spend a dime in Syria. Not the Turks, not the Americans. In the beginning of this war, we asked the Turks to go in and help fix Syria. And we said, we'll be in right behind you. The Turks said, you go in first and we'll be right behind you. And it quickly became a you first situation, which shows you nobody wants to get involved and sucked into the swamp. And so, without somebody getting involved, you could do a Yugoslavia, but of course Yugoslavia means a NATO army, tons of help over 20 years to occupy, separate, and police. That would be a solution for Syria. Get an Alawite enclave on the coast, let the Kurds have their own thing, and help build up a Syrian state in the middle. But that takes years of occupation and lots of money. And nobody's going to do that for Syria. So in a sense, the militias and these commanders have the rule of the land as far as the eye can see.
That actually takes us to our next question that came from the audience, which is a great one, is how beneficial would an independent Kurdistan be to the US?
Well, they're turning out to be very beneficial in the sense that we were already building an air base in the Kurdish part of Iraq. We have strong relations with the Kurds. Doing the same thing in Syria could be beneficial as well. The trouble is that the PYD that runs the Syrian Kurds is PKK, is under Öcalan. The Turks are very worried, and probably justly so, that Öcalan has his eye really on Eastern Turkey. He wants an independent Kurdish Eastern Turkey to join a greater Kurdistan. The Turks know this. They're not going to let it happen. They'd rather see the Kurds driven out of Syria by ISIS than to see a new civil war emerge in eastern Anatolia. So they're not going to go along with America in supporting the Kurds. And we can do it, but we're going to alienate the Turks entirely if we do it. And that's our conundrum. We're dropping a little bit of weapons into Kobani, but Kobani is indefensible in the long run for the Kurds. It's not going to be part of any independent Kurdistan. It's stuck in the middle of an Arab and Turkish sea. So it's an odd place for America to be doubling down. But we can't allow these people to be ethnically cleansed in front of our eyes. So we're getting sucked into this ethnic soup, trying to keep it in place and not allow the great sorting out to take place. And we're going to be the protectors of the Yazidis, the Kurds of Kobani, and more.
We had Bobby Gosh here a couple of weeks ago, and his theory on ISIS was they're going to pretty much destroy themselves with their extremism. What do you think of that?
If you gave them 30 years, they would. America's not going to give them 30 years. I mean, I do think that nobody in their right mind would want to live under ISIS forever. But today, ISIS looks good to many people who've been traded. There was a wonderful interview with a woman from near Raqqa, the capital of ISIS. She says she hasn't been able to send her kids to school for 4 years. There's been militia after militia reconquering the town that she lives in back and forth. It's been complete chaos, robbery, criminalism. ISIS, at least, no matter how much you disagree with them, ISIS brought order. And for her, order was what she wanted. And she doesn't know what will happen if ISIS is destroyed. Who's going to get the town, which militia, and whether they'll be better than ISIS. So there are many Syrians who are like that today, who just want stability. And ISIS, that's why all of Iraq fell to ISIS. People wanted ISIS more than they wanted the Baghdad government. That was the clear choice. And so I don't think that it's just a flash in the pan. When you look at Baghdadi and the structure of his rule, it's not very different from Saddam Hussein or Bashar al-Assad. He's doing what's required to unify a very disunited region, which is chopping heads off, being brutal, but selling an ideology of Islam, Sunni dignity, the truth.
The Syrian conflict has spilled over to Lebanon and Jordan as well. What do you think will happen in a fragile, small country such as Lebanon or Jordan?
Well, one reason I think the United States does not want Assad to fall is because should the militias of the north be armed by the US or somebody else and move down on these population centers, Hama, Damascus, and particularly the coast where all the Alawites live, there would be a massive refugee outflow. Another one to Lebanon and to Jordan, which could cause the collapse of both those countries. The United States does not want to see that happen and is trying to shore up Lebanon and Jordan. So, in a sense, they're defending Assad. That's why they say no to Turkey. They say no to the rebels when they ask for more arms and better arms. So, in the long run, Lebanon in the short run, Lebanon's held up very well. In the long run, you've got 1 million, mostly Sunni, refugees in Lebanon. Half of the parliament of Lebanon today is Christian. 1/4 is Shiite, 1/4 is Sunni. The president is Christian. 1/3 of the population is Christian. But now, that's a country of 4 million people, but now there's 1 million more Sunnis. Hungry, radicalized in some instances, and terribly unjustly treated. They're like the Palestinians. When I was a kid, I would ride a horse on Sunday with my dad through Sabra and Shatila to the beach, and then we could canter along the beach, which was empty. And we would go through these little Palestinian camps. All the kids would come running out and beg for the carrot or the sugar cube I had in my pocket to feed my horse at the end of this little ride. And I was torn as an 8-year-old. Do I feed my horse or the Palestinian? And I knew that the world something was desperately wrong. And my father would say to me, someday these people are going to get revenge. They're not going to just stay here. And that's what it's like for the Lebanese in Lebanon. The Palestinians, many Lebanese, think the Palestinians started the civil war by throwing the balance off in Lebanon in 75. But the Syrian refugee load in 10 or 15 years is going to change the face of Lebanon.
To what extent would you say the war in 2003 in Iraq created this problem, or created ISIS?
Of course it unleashed a Pandora's box of sectarianism. That sectarianism was there. The lid was on it, and it was held together. How would things have fared if America had not toppled Saddam? Certainly it would have been different. I don't think that the regimes that existed there, Saddam's and Assad's, which were brutal regimes, which dealt bad government, would have survived in the long run. Of course, everything would have been different. But, I think it did unleash this genie from the bottle, and we're seeing a much more rapid sort of gobbling up of the region along these sectarian lines today. But those, it's always hard to know whether it's the colonialists or the natives who are responsible for these things. And probably it's a matter of a little bit of both.
There's a good question from the University of Houston. ISIS's greatest recruitment tool is continued US or foreign intervention and military intervention especially. What do you think of negotiation as a new way of dealing with ISIS?
Well, of course we are negotiating with ISIS all the time, in a sense by choosing what to bomb, not bombing population centers and this sort of thing. But I don't think the United States is going to negotiate, obviously, with ISIS. But we may not destroy it entirely either. We say we're not negotiating with Assad, but in a sense we are. by choosing certain targets, not choosing other targets. We're not helping the rebels around Aleppo. We could bomb in front of the rebels and help them take Aleppo. We're not doing that. So that's a form of, I don't know what, we're hurting his enemies. But we're not going to make, I can't imagine any president getting caught negotiating with ISIS. We didn't do it for the captives who had their heads chopped off. And the parents of those captives were brokenhearted because America seemed cold-hearted. I don't think that America is about to change that tactic.
What do you think of the national media's understanding and reporting on ISIS?
Well, I think the whole Syria situation has been very difficult to report on, largely because you didn't have access after the first 6 months, and you had to rely on local people. And local activists have been spinning the situation in both directions, whether it's a pro-Assad way or a pro-rebel way. So it's very hard to get a real sense of what Syrians... And it's impossible to tell the story of what Syrians want, because there really isn't a Syria anymore. There are lots of different Syrias. But a reporter on the ground can at least begin to tell that tapestry. Today, lots of reporters got very heavily engaged on one side or the other. And I suppose that's normal in any civil war. But the reporting has been, it hasn't been what we hoped it would be. And I think that's partly because the whole reporting industry, news industry, is going through this incredible transformation with a lot of young people. We're relying on all these new forms of journalism which are paying very little. And you get what you pay for to a certain degree.
Take us to the last question. It's a discussion we had at lunchtime. I can't help but think that a lot of what you said in terms of action or inaction on the part of the Obama administration only supports the theory that this is a divide and conquer policy on the part of the US.
Well, you're absolutely right. I think most Middle Easterners believe, they blame America. They side with Hillary Clinton, who believe that if we'd gone in early and fast, we could have saved Syria from this terrible fate, that we have been dishonest. Abdel-Jabbar Aghidi, a leader of the rebels in the first half of this rebellion, who was the go-to man for America of the moderate rebels, the head of the Aleppo Free Syrian Army, under the command of General Idris, who was the supreme military command that America helped set up. He made a video in which he said to these Tunisians who he was talking to, their phone conversation was recorded and put on YouTube, but he said, America is secretly allied with Iran, Hezbollah, and even Assad to destroy Islam. What he means by Islam is Sunni Islam, of course, which is the real Islam. How many Shiites are in Guantanamo? He asked his interlocutors. None. How many Shiite organizations are proscribed on the treasury list of terrorist organizations? Of course, he didn't mention Hezbollah and a few others, but they're mostly Sunni. We've been fighting a war of terror since 9/11 on the Sunni Islamist organizations like Al-Qaeda that bombed us. We destroyed the Sunni government in Iraq and put Shiites. We're now not destroying Assad the way we promised we would. They see that America, they believe, many people believe, that America is intentionally chewing up the Middle East, breaking it into small factions in order to destroy Islam, destroy the Arabs, and to rule, get the oil. Very hard to dissuade people in the region of this fact. But that is a wide-held belief.
I shared with you earlier today that actually there's a lot of Shiite Arabs that believe that Obama is a Sunni Muslim. And his aim is to destroy, that's how he's going to destroy Iran. Thank you very much.
not disrupting our to be here, and thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you very much.